So next we're going to add some simple lighting to our scene. So we're going to start in the Create menu and talk a little bit about the difference between photometric and standard lighting. And then we're going to go ahead and create our light and add it to our scene. And we're going to end up with a nicely lit scene. We're going to talk a little bit about the exposure control settings. That's 8 on your keyboard to bring up Environment and Effects tab. And we're going to be using what's called photographic exposure control. And we're going to talk a little bit about this exposure value and position our light and talk a little bit about the different shadow options that we have and the different emit light shapes that we have, as well as how to change the color of our light and increase the intensity. So for lighting, we want to go back over to the Create tab, and instead of using the Geometry or Shapes tab, we want to use the Lights option here, which is the third button from the left. There's also a pull-down menu that contains photometric and standard, and this is an interesting little tidbit here is that by default most scenes in Max are using the scanline rendering system. However, by default the light tool wants to create photometric lights. If you're using the scanline rendering system, you'll want to use the standard light type. However, since we're using mental ray, we want this to say photometric. This will just give us real-world lights to work with that give us much better lighting calculations. Now to create a light, we simply activate the free light button, and this is going to initially ask us if we want to set up the scene for photometric exposure control, or I'm sorry, photographic exposure control. In this case, yes, we want to click yes, we want to use photographic exposure control. This will change some settings in the Environment Effects tab, which we'll talk about more in the more advanced classes. Next, we're going to just go ahead and drop this light into our scene. And you can see that your scene should basically turn fairly dark in this case. It might not be quite this dark in your case, but it probably is. This is because we're now using this light source as opposed to a somewhat default light system. If your system does not look like this, what you should do is click on the Realistic tab here in the upper left-hand corner of your viewport. Go down to Lights and Shadows and make sure that you're using Illuminate with Scene Lights, as this will give us a more realistic preview of what our lights are actually doing in our scene. Now obviously this is not how we want to light our scene, so we're going to start by simply selecting the Z-axis or our Z-axis constraint and moving our light up into our scene, and you can see that it starts to illuminate the ground plane a little bit better, and then it starts to illuminate our letters quite a bit better. Now once we've got this in a somewhat realistic spot, I mean, we might be able to bring it up a little bit higher. We're going to press 8 on our keyboard to bring up what's called the Environment and Effects tab. And this is going to allow us to do some initial tuning so that the lighting won't be so hard to adjust. This is much like you would do with a camera, where you take an exposure of the scene and then you take your shot based on the lighting that you've created. Well, in this case, we're going to go ahead and try to set up our exposure first. So with one light in our scene, we're going to hit Render Preview. And this is going to show us basically what we see on the screen here. But what's nice about this is that it's going to be interactive as well. So as I start to adjust this, we'll get a better idea of what our rendering would actually look like in this case, right? So the higher I bring this, the darker the scene gets. And, you know, coming down to in my case here, a range of about 6 or 7. That'll probably be pretty similar for what you guys experience. Seems like a good spot for us to start from. It's not really blowing anything out, but we are getting some nice highlights around the different objects in our scene. So by simply moving this light up into the air and then going and pressing 8 on our keyboard, that's going to be the keyboard shortcut to bring up the Environment and Effects tabs. That's the number 8. We are able to adjust the exposure value in the photographic exposure control to give us a bit better of a starting point for our lighting. Next, we can have some fun playing around with the settings for the light in our scene. So let's go to the Modify panel inside of the Command panel, which is the second tab. And we're going to start by, let's say, turning on shadows. It seems obvious enough. And in this case, we're going to select a different shadow type. Shadow maps are great for the scanline renderer, but we want something a bit more beefy. So we're going to use the ray traced shadow system. Now that's going to give us not so much better preview shadows, but when we render it's going to look fairly nice. Now to take full advantage of these ray trace shadows, we're also going to change this light emit shape to a sphere. and this is going to change these settings a little bit, and it's going to give us the option to apply a radius. Now, this radius will basically make these shadows softer the larger we make it. Now, this is something that the renderer is going to have to really work to calculate. It gives you a pretty good preview here of a softer edged shadow, but we're going to want to hit Shift Q again to render this out to really get an idea of what is happening to our shadows. Now, these renderings do start to take a little bit of time, so we'll have to be a little bit patient. And at certain points, you'll probably see me pause the video, as you watching me render probably is not very helpful. But this one's almost done, so let's just go ahead and let this one finish out. But you can see that we're getting some nice soft shadows there. Okay, so that shadow setting right there is a very handy way to get some just, some nice soft shadow going on in our scene. And you can see again that the preview tries to give you a glimpse of that, as opposed to that hard line that it initially starts out with. But to get a really good understanding of what that's going to look like, we want to go ahead and render it. Now that we've got our shadow working, we can also come in here and adjust the intensity of the light a little bit. So if we want to bump that up a little bit, we can just use this slider here. Now, this intensity has a few different settings. The first one is called lumens. That's going to be a much higher value. Next is candelas. That's probably something most of you have at least heard before. And then there's the LAXT, which is a European light standard. We're just going to use candelas, and we're just going to go ahead and adjust this slider. And as you can see, if I bring it up quite a bit, we're getting back to where we were before we did exposure control, which is not what we want. Really, I kind of liked where we were, so I'm just going to undo that, and we're just going to tweak this a little bit here and there just to brighten it up just a little bit more than what we had. But I'm pretty happy with the overall effect of this light. When we start to add more lights, we'll probably get into tuning this a little bit more. We can also add a filter color, so we can come in here and maybe just give this a slight bit of yellow. So let's just slide ourselves over to yellow here, and then inside of the white here, just bring this up. A good guide that I like to give people when coloring the lighting is unless you're going for the kind of effect where the lens has like a blue lens cap on it or something like that, you want to pretty much stay in this bottom quarter, or even eighth, or I guess that's more like a quarter of the saturation bar here, okay? Because otherwise, basically, you're just making everything yellow, which, is not necessarily what you want. I guess this still reads red and this still reads orange, but I definitely don't want it to be that yellow. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of yellow, and that's just going to help just sort of add a little bit to my scene. Just press OK, and it'll save that setting, and we're good to go. It's also worth noting that you could also type in the degrees, the temperature of your light. So if you wanted a really hot light, for example, it starts to get blue. If you wanted a really low level light, it starts to get really red. This is, again, for very real world lights. You can actually dial in the exact Kelvin of your light. Or you can use a bunch of the presets that we have here, such as daylight or light white, or any of these other different colors that are available. So I'm just going to start off with that. Now, the filter color sits on top of that, so we would want that to be white most likely if we were using these, unless we had, a colored glass or something on top of our light. Okay, so now we have a nice start to the lighting for our scene. Remember, we started off in the Create tab underneath the Lights section using the photometric option here in the pull-down menu. Just also remember that the standard light is really more for the scanline rendering system. We want to use photometric lights for the mental ray rendering system. So we started off by creating a free light, and then we moved that up into the scene and used the Environment and Effects tab, which again is 8 on your keyboard, to give us a better initial exposure for the lighting in our scene. We set this to 7 in our case. It is worth noting that you can use this little slider here. You can actually type in values here to get a little bit more finite with it if you want. I'm just going to leave mine at 7.0 as that's the way I set it up, and I liked it that way. And then we went into the some of the settings for the lights itself. We turned on shadows. We made sure that we're using the ray traced shadows, which is going to give us a slightly more nice result with the mental ray rendering system. Again, the shadow map is great for the scanline rendering system, but for the mental ray rendering system, we can take advantage of ray casting a little bit better, and especially using this emit light from shape and turning it into sphere and increasing the radius, we can get some nice soft shadows around the edges there, which is just a nice feel. Again, you'll want to render it, as the preview is really just a preview. It's doing a pretty good job in this case, but not necessarily the quality that you'll get when you actually go ahead and render this. Then we talked a little bit also about the color filters that you can add to lights. So once again, you get the color selector when you select on this little box. And we talked about the difference between lumens and candelas and LAXT. And generally, we're just going to use candelas and just increase this or decrease this to give us more or less light in our scene.